Hello, Anand, and welcome to the 8th installment of our 2021 GLARE T-Rest virtual seminar series. My name is Smita Tyagi, and I am PhD student at School of the Environment at University of Windsor.
And Annie, my name is Kate Ekato. I am a PhD student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University in Detroit.
We are your hosts for today's seminar. I want to extend our thanks to our speaker for being here today.
To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the University of Windsor and Wayne State University sits on the traditional territory of the three Fire Confederacy of First Nation, Anishinaabe, Peoria, Miamian, and Mississauga nations.
We, as the Windsor and Wayne, are grateful to the traditional steward of this land and are grateful for the opportunity to have learned from knowledge keepers throughout this series, including our traditional ecological knowledge panel earlier this year. For those who might have missed it, please visit our GLARE T-Rest YouTube channel to watch this panel and previous seminars and panels from the past year.
This is the fourth seminar in the 2021 series. We are excited to announce our final expert panel focused on climate change and engaging community on environmental issues. Save the date, Friday, March 26th at 10 a.m. Also, we are pleased to announce our final offering for the GLARE T-Rest virtual series, which will take place on Friday, April 9th at 10 a.m. featuring us, the graduate students from the GLARE T-Rest graduate programs. Save the date, and we look forward to ending this collaboration with a showcase of our research via lightning talks on the night. Please stay tuned for more information in the coming weeks.
Today, Dr. Ali, an associate professor in the School of Environmental Sciences, University of Guelph, Canada, will present on ecohydrological connectivity from abstract concept to management tool.
As part of the ground rules, everyone should already be on mute and have their video off. Please confirm that, and if not, please mute and turn video off now. Your chat facilitators today are Ryan and Zoha. Please send your questions to them and they will pass them on to me or Smita and the speaker. This talk will be recorded and posted online at a later date, and we would like to ask our technical team to initiate the recording now if it is not already recording. The format of the seminar goes as follows. Speaker will deliver a short seminar presentation for 30 minutes. Early career researchers are encouraged to stay for the second half, which is focused on career mentorship Q&A style discussion with the panel.
To introduce today's speaker, our speaker, Dr. Genevieve Ali, is an associate professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph since January 2019. Before moving to Guelph, she spent close to 7 years at the University of Manitoba as a faculty member and as a co-lead of a provincially funded research chair known as the Watershed Systems Research Program. Dr. Ali's recent focus has been on engineered landscapes where natural hydrological processes are significantly altered by human infrastructure. The main thrust of her research is water and material connectivity that she studies to improve watershed process understanding, but also to guide science-based policymaking. I would like to thank Dr. Ali for being here today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Ali by briefly turning on your camera and offering a wave or thumbs up. While you are doing that, I now invite Dr. Ali to take the virtual floor and begin with the seminar.
Great, thanks very much. I like the waving thing. I should do that more often. Okay, so I'll just take a minute to share my screen and then we'll be good to go. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the kind introduction. and it was already an introduction about connectivity, so I guess I don't need to say much about this. So basically, as my presentation title says, I would like to talk to you about connectivity today because it's a topic that I've been working on for, I guess, over a decade now. That started at the beginning of my PhD, so I guess that means 15 years. But anyway, so what I really want to discuss is how the concept of connectivity, which is still seen really as an academic concept, how it could potentially be used to better manage eco-hydrological systems. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So the first question, of course, is what is connectivity? And one thing that's really important to acknowledge is the fact that connectivity is both an everyday word and a scientific concept. So I'm sure that many of you listening, if not all of you, I've already used the word connectivity to refer to your internet, your friends on social media, your brain neurons, or whatever else. And so from an environmental science standpoint, if we keep things very general, connectivity can be defined as the probability that a location A will be able to transmit something to a location B. And then some people would also refer to connectivity as being the degree to which a system allows or facilitates the movement of material or information among its different components. And so when we focus on hydrologic connectivity or eco-hydrological connectivity specifically, then we are looking at the water-mediated transfer of matter, energy, and or organisms. So there are different qualifiers that can be I guess, juxtaposed to the term connectivity, and the hydrologic qualifier is only one of them. So the phrase landscape connectivity is definitely a popular one. Now, we also acknowledge that connectivity can take place along different dimensions. So there would be upland, lowland, upstream, downstream, or surface, subsurface, which is why we also have the phrases lateral connectivity, longitudinal connectivity, and vertical connectivity. And then when we really want to focus on different types of material that are moving across the landscape, then we can again change terminology a little bit and use phrases like sedimentological connectivity, chemical connectivity, biological connectivity, or just material connectivity, really. I guess just to provide an overview of terminology, again, another way to look at the different facets of connectivity is to look at pathways first, and then passive versus active movement of materials second. And so as you can see from that flow chart here, some people focus mainly on aerial transport, which is not what I do, while others look at water transport, which is what I do. And so then water connectivity can be expressed differently depending on the depth of the flow path considered. So you could think overland versus shallow subsurface versus deep surface. And then we know that those flow paths can allow the water-mediated connectivity of sediment, chemical elements, and biota, which I color-coded here. And we consider those different types of materials separately because some of them can move passively. So you can think of water, sediments, solutes, or plant seeds, for example. But you also have some that can move actively. So you could think of frogs or salmon or ducks in the context of biota, for example. Now, why do we even care about connectivity? I guess there are two main types of reasons why connectivity has become such a big part of eco-hydrological research in the past few years. So some of those reasons are research related, and then other reasons are more policy or management related. So on the research side, one example I could give is the timing of water connectivity, which really helps us make some sense of nonlinear hydrological behavior. So hydrosystems that behave like this, where we have a linear relationship between inputs and outputs, systems like these are quite rare, and what we're rather dealing with in general are relationships that look like these. And so they're in two stages. We have no water flow or no runoff, that's what's highlighted in red here, until a critical value of precipitation or soil moisture is exceeded. And it's only once that threshold has been exceeded that runoff or river flow is generated. And that's what you can see I highlighted in blue on this slide. Now, there are a few different shapes of nonlinear hydrologic behavior that have been documented in the literature, and we're still not quite sure yet what those different shapes mean exactly. But regardless of that, one consensus is that the moment when the threshold is exceeded, that moment is an indication of the time when the landscape is quote unquote well connected enough through water for a hydrologic response to be observed downstream. So that'll be one of the research related reasons for caring about connectivity. When it comes to watershed management or policy making, I guess the concept of connectivity is meant to be interpreted in a very practical way. And the example I often give is this one here. So say we have a landscape like the one that we see on this picture with known water quality issues at the downstream end. And we also know that the vast majority of downstream pollutants have been transported from upstream via surface or subsurface water. So then the challenge really is to identify the sources of pollutants which are hydrologically connected to the watershed outlet so that we can target those sources for potential remediation. So basically what that means is that in principle, connectivity is a tool that should help us answer the question, what should we do where in terms of management. And the concept of connectivity is also important in the context of policy. And I guess that one of the biggest connectivity related policy fights has taken place and maybe still taking place to a certain extent in the context of the US Clean Water Act. And so historically in the US, a majority of waterways and wetlands could be protected under the Clean Water Act, but there have been several Supreme Court decisions that have challenged that approach. And one example of such court decisions is the Rapanos decision that I'm showing here. So it was a split decision, but most of the attention has been focused on a statement that was made by the justice that is in the middle there. So Justice Kennedy basically stated, and I'm going to highlight that citation here. So Justice Kennedy stated that for a water body to be protected under the Clean Water Act, that it needed to have a significant nexus with a navigable river. So in other words, it needed to have a significant impact on the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of a large navigable river. Now, of course, the concept of significant nexus is a legal concept. It is not a scientific one, but it is a concept that has been tied to the idea of connectivity or disconnectivity. So for example, if you have a wetland that contributes significant amounts of groundwater to a large river, or if that wetland actually prevents harmful contaminants from reaching that river, then the argument could be made for a significant nexus. So theoretically, that makes perfect sense, but practically speaking, implementing that on the ground is still quite a challenge. And so we know that connectivity is important, but the big question really is how do we measure it and how do we model it? And that is where things become tricky because in hydrology and ecohydrology, there's no consensus on how to do this. So there are dozens of connectivity definitions that exist in the literature, and therefore there is a little bit of pick and choose philosophy when it comes to measuring connectivity and modeling connectivity. And on top of that, there is the fact that the vast majority of connectivity studies are done in small experimental forested watersheds, which of course is not where most of the policy needs and the management needs actually are. Now, that being said, I would be remiss if I gave the impression that only hydrologists are struggling with how to understand, measure, and model connectivity. That's not the case. And so here you have a table that I modified after something that was published by Laura Turnbull and a group of other connectivity scientists in 2018. And you can see the degree of progress that has been made in recent years varies a little bit across disciplines. So hydrologists and geomorphologists, for example, have made some progress, but measuring approaches still present a challenge for us, as is the case for system biologists. And that is contrary to the, how am I going to call it, high level of comfort that computational neuroscientists seem to have achieved with respect to connectivity. And so basically what that means is that the science of connectivity is still in its emerging phase with some progress that has been made, but mostly in small experimental forested watersheds. So there are lots of remaining challenges and unknowns, especially in large non-forested watersheds. And so in that context, one question that comes to mind is whether there are connectivity assessment tools and methods that currently exist and that could be used to help guide large-scale land and water management efforts in a very tangible way. The answer to that question is yes, to a certain extent. And so what I'm going to do for the remainder of the talk is to show you one specific example of how we could do that. So the example I want to focus on today is that of Lake Winnipeg, which is another Great Lake located in central Canada, in Manitoba specifically. Now, Lake Winnipeg is a good choice for a case study on connectivity because it's really a poster child for large-scale water issues. So first off, the watershed associated with the lake is extremely large. We're talking of an area of almost 1 million square kilometers of land spanning Canada and the US. And there are lots of water issues in that watershed. So floods are recurrent, and some recent floods actually in southern Manitoba have made national news. Droughts are recurrent as well. And then of course there is lake eutrophication, and the hyper-eutrophic Lake Winnipeg was even identified as the most threatened lake in the world in 2013. Now, what makes flood mitigation, drought mitigation, and water pollution mitigation difficult in the Lake Winnipeg watershed is the fact that the watershed is extremely heterogeneous. And so in terms of elevation, for example, we go from the steep Rocky Mountains in the west to the low-lying, very flat terrain in the east. And so this is what is illustrated by the gradient from brown to green, from left to right on this map here. Superficial deposits also extremely variable. And so as you can see on this map, we have changes from alluvial deposits to glacial, glacial fluvial, and organic. And those differences are important simply because it's, I guess it's a little bit as if you had many different types of sponges across the watershed, and the different sponges have very different absorbing powers and therefore different susceptibilities to flooding. And then of course, land use and land cover is also variable, as you can see on this map. So agricultural use dominates, that's what you can see in brown, but we also have forest land, grassland, some urban land, and wetlands. And one of the main reasons why Lake Winnipeg is a threatened lake is nutrient runoff that's coming from the extensive agricultural areas that you can see on this map. And then, of course, another big reason is all the quote unquote engineering that is done to the formerly natural landscape. So wetland drainage and other types of man-made water drainage are very significant in the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So here I'm showing you 2 images of the exact same portion of the watershed, but one image is from 1968 and the other one is from 2005. And then you can see, and that's where I'm kind of hoping I would have a physical pointer instead of a mouse. And so you can see, if you were to focus on the right-hand side, so the 2005 image, all the hatched polygons actually correspond to wetlands that have been drained. And then the red lines that you see correspond to the ditches that were used to remove water from the depressions where the wetlands used to lie before those depressions were backfilled. And we know that these changes enhance connectivity, so they enhance the probability of runoff and nutrients being exported downstream in quite a major way. And so one idea that keeps being floated around these days to mitigate water quality is to promote hydrologic disconnectivity. So disconnectivity could be imposed onto the landscape, for example, by storing water and preventing runoff and associated contaminants from running off downstream. And that's something that we think we could do in key landscape locations. But that, of course, we would presume that we know what those quote unquote key landscape locations actually are. And the truth of the matter is that we do not. And so the news piece that you see here was published in, where's that date again? I think it was, yes, 2017. And it revealed that there was only a 1% decrease in nutrient loading to Lake Winnipeg that was achieved over a 5-year period, despite the fact that a lot of mitigation measures had been implemented in the watershed over that 5-year period and even longer. And personally, I suspect that this apparent failure, quote unquote, may be attributable to a lack of spatially targeted solutions. So conceptually, we know that runoff activation and connectivity in the landscape actually leads to higher or high river nutrient loads, which in turn lead to algal blooms in the lake. And so limiting connectivity should lead to decreasing river nutrient loads, but we're dealing with a 1 million square kilometer watershed, and it's impossible to effectively manage all of that landmass. What we could try to do, though, is to identify a limited number of target locations within the Lake Winnipeg watershed where hydrologic disconnectivity could be especially promoted to minimize algal blooms in the lake. And so that is what we looked into through a case study that we started working on about 2.5 to 3 years ago, I guess. And there were 3 main steps to our approach, really. So in step 1, to quantify the extent of algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg itself, we relied on satellite-derived chlorophyll data, so MODIS data. Then in step 2, to quantify surface and near surface runoff and its connectivity across the large watershed, we used satellite-derived soil moisture data, so SMOS data, and then we analyzed the soil moisture maps using spatial connectivity metrics, some of them that I've developed quite a while ago during my PhD, actually. And then in step 3, to kind of bring everything together, we asked one key question, which was, which watershed locations need to be connected to rivers via runoff before major algal blooms are actually observed in the lake? So we first gathered the 150 MODIS images of chlorophyll A across the lake to basically delineate or map the algal blooms. I'm not showing those images here. We also gathered over 150 SMOS-derived soil moisture maps, and those ones I'm just going to give you a brief overview of as a slideshow. So all those images, MODIS and the soil moisture, span the period 2010 to 2017, and they were acquired at a frequency of 8 days or so during the open water period. So we got good temporal coverage. Now, what I should say here is that absolute values of soil moisture do not actually tell us much about whether or not there is runoff being produced in a given pixel at any given point in time. But if we compare the pixel-specific soil moisture to pixel-specific soil characteristics, then we can actually infer the presence or absence of near-surface runoff. So that's what we did. It's just that in the interest of time, I'm skipping all the nitty-gritty methodological details to focus just on the results. So what we wanted to do was to identify areas in the watershed that were not only producing surface water runoff on a given date, but that were also connected or spatially contiguous to rivers. And so the blue patches that you see on the animation here correspond to those runoff producing and river connected areas for different dates. And so you can see from the animation that there was actually a lot of variability in surface water connectivity to rivers over the 2010 to 2017 period. And so some locations actually remain in gray throughout the whole 7-year period, which can mean one of 2 things. It's either that those areas never produced runoff that was significant enough so they would actually be reflected in the soil moisture maps, or that those areas did produce some runoff, but that runoff was not actually spatially contiguous or connected to rivers. Now, in contrast to that, you have some areas across the watershed that kind of pop up in blue really often. So those are locations that were often river connected. And then you have other patches, I guess, that pop up in blue more infrequently or more rarely, okay? So we classified then individual locations in 2 groups according to whether they were frequently or infrequently connected to rivers via surface runoff, and that's what you have here. So the bright blue locations are those that connect to rivers multiple times a year, whereas the locations in green are those that connect to rivers in a more selective manner, so more infrequently. And we were really wondering how or whether we would actually be able on the landscape to distinguish those bright blue areas from those bright blue locations from the green locations. So we looked into that, and then we observed that the blue pixels were mostly located in areas that are very proximal to rivers, so riparian areas. And then the green pixels tended to be located either at the periphery of riparian areas or completely off riparian areas. There were no major differences in terms of land use and land cover. So we could find green pixels that were in agricultural land, but some green pixels were in grassland as well. Some green pixels were even in forested corridors. And so land use was not a good predictor of whether a pixel should be green or blue. What made the blue and green pixels really different from one another, though, was their topology. So basically the position in a network. From a network analysis perspective, some of the green pixels that you can see on this map here were actually important nodes in the sense that they had the power of connecting entire upslope areas to the downstream systems, but they also had the power of disconnecting entire upslope areas from the downstream systems. And for that reason, we actually call them water gatekeepers. Now, just to explain that notion of gatekeepers a little bit, I'm going to use a conceptual diagram here to illustrate the topological difference, I guess. So typically in hydrology and ecohydrology, when we look at upstream, downstream gradients, we tend to focus on the whole contributing area. So that's, let's say, that red polygon here. And we want to know how far upstream it extends to know what quote unquote drainage area or contributing area might actually influence what we see at the downstream end. What we do have to remember, though, is that within that contributing area, we actually have a range of hydrologically active areas, so a range of runoff producing areas that are interconnected. And so those runoff producing areas are all part of a network, and their relative position within the network will actually give them a different role or a different influence. And so on the diagram that I have here, for example, the active areas, so the runoff producing areas that are in blue, those ones can be seen as ordinary nodes in the network because they do not have a disproportionate influence on the structure or the robustness of the network. That is different from the green color active areas, though. Those have a more critical role because when they become inactive, so when they stop producing runoff, and so when they turn red, they do have the ability of disconnecting everything that is upstream of them or upslope of them from the downstream systems. And so they act as switches because they can turn on or off the export from upstream to downstream. And that is the reason why we're calling them water gatekeepers. So one question you might be asking yourself is whether that topological difference actually matters. And the answer is yes. So in our case study, by comparing the watershed connectivity maps to the lake chlorophyllate data, we observed one thing, and that was that we needed at least 50% of the green locations, so at least 50% of the water gatekeepers, to be connected to rivers for more than 8 weeks in a given year before major blooms could be observed in the lake. So if that dual criterion of 50% over 8 weeks was not actually satisfied, then either we observed no algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg, or we did observe some, but they were moderate, so they covered less than 30% of the surface of the lake. And so that means that we were able to establish a quantitative linkage between surface runoff connectivity in the watershed and algal blooms in the lake. And we were also able to identify specific watershed locations, the green pixels, that appear to be especially influential in driving that linkage per se. And so what we think as of now is that knowing where gatekeepers are can be quite valuable in a management context, because since the location of gatekeepers gives them greater than normal influence on the network that they're part of, then it is reasonable to think that implementing mitigation measures where they're located may also give us greater than normal returns on our investment per se. And so I'm reminding you then of the question I was asking at the beginning, which was, are there connectivity assessment tools or methods that currently exist and that could be used to help guide large-scale land and water management efforts in a tangible way? The answer, I think, is yes, because in our Lake Winnipeg case study, we use connectivity metrics and network theory concepts that have been reviewed in the ecohydrology literature in the past decade. And they allowed us to assess water and associated nutrient connectivity over a very large watershed area. So yes, for, I guess, water, nutrient, and potentially sediment connectivity. What we were not able to do, though, in our case study was to carry what I would call a truly multi-material assessment of connectivity that would have included a biotic component or an ecological component as well. And the reason why we were not able to do that is because there's no established framework yet for doing so. And so before we can really try to assess multi-material landscape connectivity, we probably need to agree on the notion of quote unquote optimal landscape connectivity first. And so I guess one question I'm throwing out there is, whether there is such a thing as optimal water, optimal nutrient, optimal sediment, and optimal biological connectivity. And if that notion of optimal connectivity actually does exist, then is it something that landscape managers should actually aim for? And so I'm posing this as a question here because in some landscapes that have a great degree of human impact, there is often a need to enhance the connectivity of some materials while at the same time promoting the disconnectivity of other materials. And so just going to use one example here quickly to illustrate this. So take a landscape like this one. Ecologists know very well that agricultural expansion can severely affect movements of biota and therefore affect ecological connectivity. And so in predominantly agricultural landscapes, there is a need to increase ecological connectivity, which is why sometimes ecological corridors like the forest corridor that you can see on this picture are established. That said, while there is often a big push to increase ecological connectivity in landscapes like this one, I would argue that in turn, there is a need to promote hydrologic disconnectivity and chemical disconnectivity as well. So yes, we wish to enhance biological connectivity and minimize habitat fragmentation, but at the same time, we also wish to prevent excess water and excess nutrients, which are associated with agricultural operations, from traveling downstream. And so what that means is that in human impacted landscapes or multi-purpose landscapes, we might actually need what I'm calling connectivity trade-offs. And we may need to evaluate those trade-offs within a 3-axis connectivity framework like the one that I drew here. Intuitively, because we see connectivity as a natural process, we tend to think that the greater the connectivity, the better. And if that's what we were actually aiming for, then we would be maximizing connectivity along all 3 axes. And that would put us in the situation associated with the black cross sign there. In most landscapes, however, what we rather need to identify is a range of desirable conditions across the 3 connectivity axes. And the desirable range may not necessarily be aligned with the maximum values. And so this is what my gray star would actually represent here. So the reason why I'm showing you that 3-axis framework is because it is often described in theory, because this is the one that truly captures eco-hydrological connectivity, but it is not commonly used in a practical way yet. And so I think that this is a topic that really should be at the forefront of the connectivity science agenda, because if we truly want to have holistic, multi-material view of landscape connectivity, then we're required to work across disciplines so as to agree on what would need to be measured along each of those 3 axes and how. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping up here by saying that to kind of piggyback on the last point I was making, that we really need discipline-specific, but also cross-disciplinary discussions to assess how we can use the concept of connectivity, yes, for process understanding, like I tend to do a lot, but also for environmental management at spatial and temporal scales that are actually relevant from a policy standpoint. We know that connectivity is a key metric of watershed health and resilience, simply because we know that connectivity underlies a lot of real-world environmental issues. So should it be flood dynamics, like I was discussing before, or droughts, or eutrophication, drinking water supply, like connectivity is mentioned in OECD documents, biodiversity conservation, human health, and others. So we know that connectivity is important, and conceptually, we think it could be a great management tool. The problem is that the science is just not completely there yet. And so if you were to ask stakeholders or environmental managers, for example, about connectivity, then many would probably say that they have some intuitive knowledge about what it is, but it is not a concept or a notion that they would feel comfortable using in their day-to-day work per se. And so the case study I talked about earlier was just one example of how we can use some, because there are more than what I showed, so some existing connectivity assessment tools to look at the management of water and associated nutrients a bit differently. So for example, as a hydrologist, I know that hydrologists tend to focus on water volumes quite a lot, but in our case study, we did not focus on water volume at all. We just focused on presence, absence of water and connectivity. And we were still able to establish a clear quantitative linkage between runoff water distribution in the watershed and algal blooms in the lake downstream. Now, earlier I mentioned as well that the vast majority of water and nutrient connectivity research tends to be done in small forested watersheds using point scale experimental data. With our case study, we were also quite happy to show that we could actually perform water connectivity assessments across large spatial scales by relying on publicly available imagery data. From a practical standpoint, I would say that the locations that we call water gatekeepers in the Lake Winnipeg watershed, they only cover 10% of the whole watershed, but at the same time, they do seem to play a critical role in major bloom occurrence in the lake. And so what that could mean from a management standpoint is that we could actually target those landscape locations which we know to be especially critical for connectivity. And so that is a practical benefit, because if we can zoom in on only 10% of the watershed, then those 10% of locations become our high priority targets. And then we can evaluate different management or mitigation strategies only at first at those higher priority targets. So in terms of next steps, where are we going with this? So a few things. What we're exploring now is whether the approach that we use in the case study I presented earlier, for example, could be applied elsewhere. So when it comes to the gatekeepers, for example, our Lake Winnipeg watershed case study was, I guess, a proof of concept of some sort. And so I have a PhD student right now, Crystal Siebert, who is currently working on devising a similar approach, but this time for the Lake Erie watershed. And then I also have a research associate, Kayla Wong, who is trying to identify key water gatekeepers, but this time in the context of combined storm and sewer systems that we rely on to manage excess runoff water and wastewater as well, mostly in cities and seas. When it comes to the optimal landscape connectivity idea and how it could or should be defined, that's also something that we're trying to push forward a little bit more. So I've been working on that with a great group of biologists and hydrologists from the USCP and the USGS in particular. And so I'm really hoping that we can come up with one or multiple paths forward related to that soon. And so basically my take-home message would be that turning the concept of connectivity into an effective management tool is still a big goal, but it remains very much a work in progress. And lots of options are being considered right now based on feasibility, data requirements, what the management objective of the landscape or the watershed actually is, etc. So still pretty much an open-ended question and field. And so if some of you listening have some ideas about any of those topics, then I would be quite happy to actually hear about them. So I think I'm over time, but that's where I wanted to end today anyway. So thank you very much for your attention, and then I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.
I think you're muted, Smita. You're muted.
Sorry about that.
Nice.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, for such an informative presentation. I wish we had more time. It's such so much information in such short time. And I am for audiences, please send your questions to our chat facilitator Ryan and Zoha. And yeah, let's take up questions from audience. Kate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ali. Like Smita said, this was a very informative session. Even though the time was short, it was quite informative for me. Our first question, before we go to the audience question, I think we just have one, is what advice would you give to early career researchers to have successful career in your field of work?
Yeah, that's a very broad question. I think I'm going to answer it in a very simple way, which is to try and be as open-minded and interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary in terms of collaborations as possible. And the reason why that is because I think that my own path since the beginning of my PhD really has been really enjoyable because I've made sure to always go elsewhere in terms of other disciplines to see whether they were actually looking at either the same problem as I am or slightly different problems as I am with different tools. And I'm never disappointed in the sense that there is no, I find that in my work anyway, there is no real problem that is truly unique. Just earlier, I was talking about brain neuroscience, for example. It's actually incredible to see the parallels that you can draw between neurons connectivity in the brain and runoff generating areas connectivity in a watershed. And so as long as you can make those parallels, then that means that you can actually borrow tools and methods from other disciplines as well and try them out. And that's something that I really, really enjoy doing. I think it has made me successful as well, because even if I'm addressing or revisiting a question that people have used before or have addressed before, using that new tool that I might be borrowing from another discipline actually gives me the kind of the novel or the novelty hook. And so that's something that in terms of writing papers and then pushing for some ideas sometimes has been quite not easy, but quite enjoyable because it's just different. And so yeah, I would say be as open-minded as possible. Now there's always a danger of basically stretching yourself too thin because you're trying to be too broad. So that's a bit of a fine line to walk. But I would say that this is what has made my own path really enjoyable. So yeah.
Thank you. Smita.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Yeah, I have a question from John Breton. Any groundwater elements of this research, given the importance of that pathway as a connector and the recent Supreme Court Maui decision?
A recent Supreme Court what?
Maui. I hope I'm.
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't actually know this one. I've heard of it, but I don't know the details of it. So the question about the groundwater is extremely important. One thing that I probably didn't stress at all or enough during the presentation, which I should stress now, is I am of the opinion that if we actually want to quantify water connectivity in an effective way, then we need to do it on a pathway specific or flow path specific. We need to do it in a flow path specific manner. And so what I've been focusing on in the past few years is just surface runoff connectivity or near surface runoff connectivity, because it's relatively easy to find spatially detailed data about where surface water sources actually are. With groundwater, that is much more difficult. And so even though I acknowledge that in some systems, in particular, groundwater connectivity is the main driver, this is something that without actual field data, it is a little more difficult to have detailed pixel-specific data on that would actually allow me to apply some of the spatial connectivity metrics that I've been working on in the past few years. So I guess long answer short, making my long answer shorter, my quote unquote disregard for groundwater connectivity assessment is not due to me not acknowledging how important it is, but more attributable to the fact that it is difficult to find publicly available fine resolution spatial data on groundwater that would actually allow me to carry the kind of connectivity assessments that I want to do. Now, at a small scale, that's completely different. And so during my PhD, for example, and slightly after, I was working on a small 5-hectare, 100% forested watershed, very small area. And so we basically drilled wells everywhere and kind of turned the watershed into Swiss cheese a little bit, so that we would actually be able to look at subsurface water connectivity as well. That was shallow groundwater, but still, we were able to do that because we knew that we didn't have much surface runoff connectivity. We really needed to tackle what was happening in the subsurface. And because we're only dealing with a 5-hectare area, we could actually afford to have wells everywhere and basically follow the water along. That's not something I would be able to do for the Lake Winnipeg watershed, for example. So it's more of a data limitation than than an assessment of groundwater connectivity not being important. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. And
oh yeah, sorry. And then a question about the Supreme Court decision. I don't know the details of that one, so I can't answer, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Good answer. So I'll go quickly to the next question. And it is, has there been any obstacles that you or others in your field have had to overcome to be successful? How can such barriers be overcome or addressed?
Yeah, that's another very broad and loaded question at the same time. There's definitely a lot of potential obstacles. Some of them are, I think instead of making a list of potential obstacles, I'm rather going to make a list of what I've always done to try and circumvent them. That doesn't mean that I've been successful all the time, but still. So being engaged is really, really important. So I don't know about the individual fields that everybody is in. What I would say is that the hydrology community in Canada, but also in the US, and I think in Europe as well to a certain extent, I'm just not as familiar with that, is very convivial. And so, or congenial, I guess. And so it is really important to be, quote unquote, good at what you do and be a robust scientist, etc. It's also important to be generous, because when you are, people tend to be generous to you as well. And it's also important to interact with people outside of formal settings. And so sometimes when I say that, people don't actually believe me, but that's true. I was, and still I'm, a little bit painfully shy. And so I remember at first as a senior undergraduate student and then as a PhD student, because I did a direct transfer, so I didn't actually have the time of the master's to kind of get more maturity. I did that switch directly. And so I remember at first when I was going to conferences, first, well, there was my shyness that I needed to overcome. And then second, there was just being intimidated by anybody who was more senior than me. And by definition, everybody was more senior than me. And so what I tended to do at the time was, okay, you have a conference, you get to the conference hall at 8, and then sessions are done at 6, and then you leave at 6, and that's it. And then at lunch, if you've interacted or kind of struck a friendship with somebody, well, you stick to that person the whole day or the whole week, and then you're good to go. I could have been completely fine doing that, but I found that it was really important to actually go to social events, and all the non-formal aspects of the science as well, because a lot of the science and the big discussions happen there. And so in recent years, I can come up with countless examples of me sitting at a table for dinner in a restaurant, and then we started crafting a paper on a napkin. Those are the kind of opportunities that you actually miss if you take yourself out of the more social aspects of doing science and networking. So that's something that I had to learn pretty fast, because I figured that I would actually miss out on a lot if I were not to do that. The other element is definitely the collaboration within your discipline and across your discipline as well. This is something that I don't think I did a lot of until my first faculty job. So yeah, all the way through my PhD and my postdoc, I was basically, quote unquote, sticking mainly with hydrologists, and there is nothing wrong with that. What I did realize though was that in my first faculty job in particular, because of that provincially funded research chair, I needed to interact with stakeholders quite a lot. And I realized at the time that my learning curve was steeper than it could have been, because I had not exposed myself enough to people who were doing things a little bit differently from me, and or might have a lot more experience actually interacting with the general public. So was I able to become better at it and stronger and more assured and confident? Certainly. But I think that lacking that and not having a lot of time to actually learn it made me look unsure probably at the beginning. And that probably took me then a longer period of time to actually build bridges with non-scientists. And so, yeah, this is something that's, it's strange. So this is something that I do in my teaching, but interestingly enough, I didn't think of that being important in my research as well. So when I teach, for example, I try and make sure that I'm going to cater to different learning styles. So I know that some people need to be really visual in terms of graphs. Some people need to play with things, so they need to be really hands-on. Others need to read. Some people cannot actually learn if they need to take notes at the same time as they're listening, etc. So I've always been very diligent at varying my teaching materials, I guess, to cater to all those different audiences. And for a reason I'm still baffled about, I never thought I needed to do that for research. And so, again, that's something that can be really, I think, has helped me overcome some of the obstacles that I've run into, which were not so much in the formal academic setting in universities, but more when I was actually going out and trying to convey messages or just have farmers or policymakers share things with me. So yeah, I feel like most of the obstacles I've had to overcome, I've done so by either reaching out to others more, or just taking as much or as many kind of professional development course / skills or workshop skills or skill workshops, whatever you want to call it, as possible. And to that day, if I see something and I actually have the time, I'll still register and then get that extra training, because well, in my book, you can never have enough. So, so that's a long-winded answer, but those have been my strategies, basically.
Yeah, I have one more question that's more closer to the research part. So can you elaborate on the dynamics prevailing in landscapes that have been significantly altered as a result of human activity?
So dynamics in general or connectivity in particular?
I'm more interested in connectivity, but
okay. Okay. So if I were to answer in a very general way, I would say that I was trained as a forest hydrologist first and foremost. And so it's only during my postdoc, which I did in Scotland, I didn't mention that before, which I did in Northern Scotland. So it's only during my postdoc that I started working on different types of environments. So pasture lands, grasslands, rangelands. And then when I moved to Manitoba, it's really the first time that I started working on agricultural landscapes per se. And so there are two ways I'm approaching quote unquote engineered landscapes. And I switch between one approach or the other, depending on what I feel fits best at any point in time. So the first approach is, as quote unquote a theoretician, to take the forested one as being the benchmark and to kind of try and relate everything else to it. So what makes it similar, dissimilar, and if it's dissimilar, is it dissimilar in a good way or a bad way, or a positive way or negative way, I should say. So positive or negative is not measured in terms of impact so much, but in terms of, am I getting more of a certain process or less of a certain process? So that's one approach that seems to work well for me in most instances, because I'm always comparing it to what my own benchmark actually is. Now, the other approach that I've had is a little bit different, I guess, and it was influenced by some literature. Can't remember exact paper titles right now. So there were some papers at some point that were proposing or suggesting or arguing, I don't remember exactly the tone, that engineered landscapes are actually maybe simpler to assess than natural ones because some processes have either been canceled or dampened or streamlined in such a way that predictability might actually be enhanced, I guess. And I think that in some instances that's true. In others, though, it's not. And so I was talking earlier or mentioning earlier, my research associate whom I'm working with right now to look at connectivity, but in the context of a combined storm sewer system, so CSSS. And this is a completely new area for me in the sense that she's the one who is very familiar with urban hydrology, and then I'm the connectivity person, and we're basically bringing our respective experience together to try and see, to try and look at connectivity of CSSS in the Kitchener-Waterloo region. And so through that type of work, or some of the work that I've done in Manitoba in particular, and I know that Manitoba sometimes is not a good example because it's a very peculiar type of landscape. There are, in all of my experiences so far, I've found that engineered landscapes are way more complicated than natural landscapes. Not because what I read in some of those other papers about some processes being dampened or streamlined, not because I haven't seen that, but because there are also additional elements that I never thought about. And so, for example, in parts of the prairies, because of the really low-lying flat areas, you cannot actually rely on topography to tell you where the water is going because you can actually have water flowing uphill or upslope. That's possible, again, due to engineering works on the landscape. So you can have backflow events quite a lot. You can have watershed boundaries that do not actually follow topography. You have to redelineate them by actually following the presence, absence of drainage ditches and exactly where and how they've been constructed. When it comes to the urban hydrology stuff that we're doing right now as well, kind of notice that, yes, you're going to have topographic influences and influences in terms of land use and land cover. That's to be expected. And those linkages to processes are going to be simpler than what you would expect in a natural landscape. That being said, you have all the non-natural landscape features, or what I call the human landscape features, that are basically throwing a wrench in everything in terms of exactly what type of pipes are you going to use for a CSSS system, how far or close to the surface are they going to be, what slope are they using for the different segments, how well your catch basins are connected or not connected to your actual pipes, how well your catch basins and outflows are connected or not connected to your natural streams, etc. So all those elements are actually complexifying factors. And so I think that there is room for quote unquote both theories. So the one about engineered systems being more predictable and the one about engineered systems being less predictable. It's just that in my own experience, I've been on the less predictable side more than the more predictable side. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. And we have a comment from Susana Alvarado from, she's listening to us from Mexico. And yeah, she says she stumbled upon this seminar on Twitter. So happy to listen because we are trying here to access ecohydrological connectivity of tropical mountain watersheds. Well, fracture bedrock, in hope to provide landscape management guidance. And she's asking if the seminar is going to be available later. Yes, Susanna, you can. I think one of our tech person can help her with our private YouTube channel link. And yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Ali.
No
At this
problem.
time, we would like to thank everyone for attending, and please join us on 26th of March for our next panel on communication and climate change, engaging communities in environmental issues, with our panelists Claire Sanders, Dr. Carol Miller, and Dr. Bridie McGreevy.
And save the date for our final event, the GLAD TROS Virtual Graduate Students Research Showcase on Friday, April 9th at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you all there.